Okay, we're going to read another chapter in War of the Invisibles, which is a history of the Christian church after the time of the New Testament. This chapter is called Geoffrey, and it takes place in the English Channel in AD 1559 to 1573. Geoffrey hung onto the rail as he walked along the slippery deck. Even through the thick fog, he knew his way to the captain's quarters, for he had grown up there. When Mama died, Papa could have left him with relatives, but he didn't. As captain of his own ship, Papa had brought him along. Geoffrey felt very grown up now that he was 8 years old and able to do many tasks on the ship. However, he was the only crew member who got to sleep in the captain's quarters and to eat at the table with Papa. "Geoffrey," Papa said, "please go down to the passenger cabin and check on Father Knox. Empty his chamber pot if he needs it." Geoffrey wrinkled his nose. "Ew, he doesn't do that himself?" It wasn't that Geoffrey didn't want to do what Papa had asked him. It was just unusual. However, between the fog and the rain, this voyage had been much longer and rougher than most of their crossings. The few passengers they took on their boat usually brought their own servants to take care of such things. "No," Papa explained, "he has no servants. I believe this is a secret crossing. He doesn't seem to want to be seen out on deck, unless, of course, he's just seasick." Geoffrey and Papa both laughed. A lot of big, tough guys from land turned into whimpering babies when they got out on a sea crossing like this. Geoffrey stood a little taller. He never got seasick. "Okay," he said, "I'll go check on him." Geoffrey knocked on the door of the passenger cabin and then entered. It was dark, so he struck the flint and lit a candle, setting it on the shelf next to the hammock hanging in the corner. A tall man lay in the hammock, looking miserable. By his black robes and white collar, Geoffrey guessed he must be a priest, and by the smell of the room, he seemed a very seasick priest. "Papa sent me to check on you," he said. "Oh," the priest groaned. "Tell him thank you." "Here, let me take that," Geoffrey said. "If I empty it, the room won't smell so bad, and maybe you'll feel better. I can get you a drink of water, too." As he returned, the priest seemed a little more awake. "Thank you, son," he said. "What's your name?" "I'm Geoffrey," he said. "My father is the captain of this ship." "Ah, it seems that you are a much better sailor than I am." Geoffrey laughed. "I learned to walk on this ship. I've been at sea all my life, even if it is just the English Channel." "Apparently it can get as rough out here as it does anywhere else," the priest observed. Geoffrey laughed. "Yes, you look like you've been on some pretty rough seas this afternoon." The priest smiled in spite of his obvious discomfort. "If we don't get into port soon," Geoffrey offered, "I'll come back and check on you in a little while." "That would be fine," the priest said. "I could use the distraction." "You could come up on deck," Geoffrey suggested. "Perhaps the fresh air would do you good." All of a sudden, the priest seemed less friendly and more withdrawn. "It's best I stay in my cabin," he said. "Excuse me." "Whatever you like," Geoffrey replied. "I'll see you later." He headed back to report to his papa. "Well, we were both right," Geoffrey said, bursting into his papa's cabin. "He is seasick, and he also seems to want to stay hiding in his room for some reason. Do you think he's a criminal?" Papa laughed. "I don't think so," he said, "although it's possible he could be a heretic. There has been quite a traffic of heretics back and forth to Scotland lately." "Why?" Geoffrey asked. "There's a war on in Scotland right now," Papa said. "It's been going about 2 years. The Scottish nobles are heretics, but the Queen is still a good Catholic." "But I thought the Queen of Scotland was in France," interrupted Geoffrey. "Yes, she is the Queen of France too, so she lives there with her husband. Her mother, Mary of Guise, runs Scotland for her. She has done that since Mary was a baby, because she became the Queen of Scotland when she was only 6 days old. The English king was hoping to betroth her to little Prince Edward when they were still little children, Mary of Guise infuriated them by smuggling the tiny queen across the Channel and betrothing her to the Dauphin of France instead. Anyway, the heretics are trying to force her to convert and change the government of Scotland to a Protestant government instead. Protestant? Geoffrey asked. Yes, that's a word that the heretics use sometimes. It comes from the word protest, which is what they've been doing against the Catholic Church. Ah, Geoffrey said. So Protestant means people who protest. Yes, they like that better than heretic, but we believe they're heretics. They should all be burned at the stake. Ew, Geoffrey exclaimed. Sounds awful. Yes, Papa agreed. It would be awful, but that's what we do with heretics. Geoffrey went back out onto the deck to think about this. Hours later, the fog had not lifted, and the little ship was still on the channel. The guardians hovered over it. There was no chance of this ship sinking, for one of God's important people was on board, although he didn't look as thunderous and imposing with his head in a bucket from being seasick as he did thundering from the pulpit. Geoffrey slipped back into the passenger cabin to check on him again. I just came by to see how you were doing, Geoffrey said. As the priest looked up from the bucket, he added, Well, I guess I see how you're doing. They both laughed. Here, Geoffrey offered, let me give you another drink of water. It isn't always this bad, you know. The priest nodded. Well, I guess I can tell Papa that you're just seasick, Geoffrey announced. He and I were talking, and we figured you were either seasick or a heretic hiding so that no one would recognize you. The man raised an eyebrow and looked at Geoffrey. I'm really glad you're not a heretic. Papa says they burn them. The man was quiet for a minute and said, Some people might call me that. Really? Said Geoffrey. Are you a real heretic? Wow, on our ship and everything. The man smiled. If he hadn't been so nauseated, he might have even laughed. Are you a famous heretic? Geoffrey asked, or just an unimportant one? We're all important to God, the man replied. Ah, yeah, I know, Geoffrey said. I mean to the rest of us. The man smiled at Geoffrey. Right this minute, you might be even more important to God than I am. Geoffrey paused to think for a moment. I smiled. How could any human's value to God be measured? The Almighty had already said that he would provide the life of his Son in exchange for any one of them. So all were of such tremendous value that it would boggle their human minds if they had any idea. However, right now the Almighty was using young Geoffrey, even though he was only 8 years old, to help care for his servant crossing the Channel to Scotland. You know, the priest continued, his voice getting a little stronger, God has a particular soft spot in his heart for young lads. He used them many times in his work. Really? Geoffrey asked. Like who? Well, in the Bible there's a story of a young lad who brought his lunch, and Jesus used it and multiplied it until it was able to feed 5,000 people. That's awesome, Geoffrey breathed. I wish Jesus could use me for something. He can, the priest replied. Not many years ago he used a young lad not much older than you. He did? What was his name? Geoffrey asked. His name was Edward, the priest said. He was a special friend of mine. Tell me about him, Geoffrey demanded. Edward was a young prince, the priest continued. His father died when he was still a lad. He was determined to help his people get to know God better and to understand what God wanted from them, without all of the confusion that the church has brought in. Oh, Edward was a heretic? Well, that's not what we called him, the priest answered. We called him Your Majesty. Oh, you're talking about young King Edward? Yes, he said. I was his royal chaplain. Edward wanted very much to help England to be a good Protestant country. I was working on the Book of Common Prayer that we were preparing during his reign. But Edward is dead, observed Geoffrey. Yes, the priest answered. That was very sad, and his sister was very determined for England to be a good Catholic country. I had to run for my life to Europe. Many other people have lost their lives and have been burned at the stake." "Are you the great heretic Knox?" Geoffrey asked. The priest looked at the floor and then nodded. "I've heard of him," Geoffrey said. "They've been watching for you a long time." "I imagine they have," Mr. Knox replied. "I didn't tell you this so that you could make a lot of money collecting a bounty from the English soldiers. I told you this because I want you to know how important you are to God. He loves you and has a job for you to do too." "He does? But I'm not a prince or anyone important." "Well, neither am I," Mr. Knox replied, "but the Lord has a job for all of us." Geoffrey paused to consider this. "Has your job been to hide the past few years in Europe?" "Oh, no. I was hiding from the English soldiers, but I went to Geneva and I learned a lot from another famous preacher." "Is he another heretic?" Geoffrey asked, his eyes sparkling. "Yes," replied Mr. Knox. "His name is Calvin. He lives in Geneva." "Oh, I've heard of him. He's another heretic that the church would like to get its hands on. His first name is John." "Yes," Mr. Knox said. "So is mine." Geoffrey was delighted. For the next hour, Mr. Knox continued to tell him all about the things he had learned from Mr. Calvin in Switzerland. It seemed that no time had passed at all before Geoffrey heard his father calling him. "Geoffrey, where are you? Get yourself up here on deck. We're nearing port." "I've got to go," Geoffrey said. Mr. Knox put his hand on Geoffrey's head. "God will bless you, Geoffrey," he said. "Don't forget your job." Geoffrey nodded and ran up on deck. As he helped his father with the preparations for docking in the English harbor of Hull, he kept asking himself, What job does God want me to do? Does God want me to tell the soldiers where the famous heretic is hiding?" Geoffrey shuddered. He couldn't imagine the thin man who had been so seasick being dragged away by soldiers. Even worse was the idea of him chained to a stake in flames. No, surely God had something else in mind. As the sailors carried the freight from France off the ship, the tall stranger in his black cloak slipped down the gangplank and into the crowd. He had no luggage, and in a moment he blended in and was gone. Geoffrey watched him go. He was glad he hadn't told, but he wondered if it was a sin not to tell on heretics, and if God would be mad at him. I drew close. Geoffrey was the type of boy whom God could use. Mr. Knox was right. As long as his heart was open, I knew that the Almighty would send His Spirit to guide him and help him understand that sin is just separation from God, a very human condition, and that it is not necessary to tell on others so that they could be dragged away and burned to please the Almighty. He had been very clear in His Word about how to please Him. Humans just needed to find out what that was, and I knew that even an illiterate boat boy like Geoffrey would learn. The English Channel, A.D. 1560. For days, Geoffrey continued to think about the heretic, Mr. Knox, and all of the things that he had told him. So many of the things Mr. Knox had said made good logical sense, but Geoffrey was confused. He and Papa had always been Catholic, and although they weren't in port very often, Geoffrey had gone to church when they were and made his confession to the priest. Business was good in the following weeks, and Geoffrey and his father had had no opportunities to see a priest in port, for their ship was busy going back and forth across the channel. Geoffrey felt as if he would burst if he couldn't talk to someone or get some answers. Finally, one day in his cabin, he remembered something Mr. Knox had said, that humans didn't really need a middleman. Would God be willing to listen directly to them without going through the proper channels like a priest? What if Mr. Knox was wrong? What if he tried to talk to God and it made God angry? Geoffrey had an anxious little ball of fear growing in his stomach, but he felt if he couldn't get some answers soon, he would just burst. Kneeling in his father's cabin, he said, God, I know that you're king of the universe, and that you're very important, and I know that I'm only a cabin boy on a channel ship, and I'm not very important. but I just have to talk to you. I haven't been able to see a priest for a long time. I hope you don't mind. Mr. Knox said you wouldn't. I hope Mr. Knox is a friend of yours." Geoffrey paused. Suddenly, a great feeling of peace filled him. I backed up to my perimeter of the room out of respect. The Spirit of the Almighty was present. It was as amazing to me as it would have been to Geoffrey could he have seen who was there. The Spirit, ruler of the universe, chose to be in that tiny ship cabin at the beckoning of a young boy. The passion with which the Almighty loves these humans is overwhelming even to those of us who have seen it again and again. Then, right there in the cabin, he gently nudged Geoffrey's memory and helped him to remember things he had been taught. Having only human sight, Geoffrey may not have been able to see him, but it was obvious he could feel his presence, and Geoffrey continued to pray. The English Channel, A.D. 1561. "Papa," Geoffrey asked, "what was the royal messenger visiting you about?" Geoffrey had been dying to ask ever since they had left the English harbor. Papa smiled grimly. "He brought some news and a warning from the Queen," he said. "You know that the King of France died last week." "Yes," Geoffrey said. "That was sad. He was so young, almost the same age as me." Father nodded. "He was almost twice your age, but still way too young to die," he said. "The young Queen has been left a widow. She is still only a teenager." "That's very sad," said Geoffrey. "However, she's still Queen of France and of Scotland, isn't she?" "Yes and no," Papa replied. "She is still the Queen of Scotland, but in France, now that her husband has died, his younger brother has become king. He's not married yet, but his mother, Catherine of Medici, also a queen, is his advisor. She has never liked young Queen Mary, and I expect things are very uncomfortable for her there in the French court now." Geoffrey nodded and then asked, "But Papa, why would the English Queen send that type of news to us? Does she care?" "Oh, yes," Papa answered. "The English Queen is a cousin of Mary, the young French Queen, but they hate each other." "Why?" "Oh, many reasons," Papa said. "For one thing, the English Queen is a Protestant, so Queen Mary of France at Scotland considers her a heretic. Also, remember that when Queen Mary was a baby, she had been promised to Elizabeth's brother Edward. However, Queen Mary's family was Catholic. Edward was a Protestant. So the tiny queen was smuggled out of Scotland and taken to France, where she married the Dauphin instead. When the Dauphin's father died, he became King of France." "Ah," Geoffrey said, "I can see why they wouldn't like each other." "Oh, it's worse than that. Queen Elizabeth's mother married King Henry VIII only after he divorced his first wife. Since Catholics don't believe in divorce, they do not believe that Queen Elizabeth has a legitimate child, and therefore Queen Mary of France and Scotland would be the next closest relative." "Ah," said Geoffrey, "so Catholics feel that Queen Mary, not Queen Elizabeth, should be the Queen of England." "That's right," Papa said. "The last Queen of England, Queen Mary, was a Catholic. When Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, she chose not to continue making Britain be a Catholic country. So many of the loyal Catholics in England feel that Mary of France and Scotland should be Queen of England too. Queen Elizabeth sent messages to all of the captains of ships back in English harbors asking us to watch for Mary. She's afraid Mary will try to come back across the Channel and may try to take the throne of England from her." "Do you think she will?" Geoffrey asked. "Well, apparently the thought has crossed her mind," said Papa, "since she calls herself the Queen of England as well. She does not recognize Elizabeth's claim to the throne and includes that in her titles." Geoffrey mused. "This could be interesting." "Yes," his father agreed. "Our job is to run this boat back and forth in the Channel and take people where they need to go. I don't care what their religion or whom they serve, as long as they pay for their passage." Geoffrey smiled. He was glad his father felt that way. He knew that many of the people they had been transporting had been heretics. They had been leaving France in small groups, like Mr. Knox, some going to Scotland, some going to England. Others they took up the Channel, depositing them in Belgium and Holland. France was becoming a more difficult place for heretics to live every day. Geoffrey enjoyed this. He'd had more opportunities to ask questions and had been receiving answers. He knew that transporting heretics was illegal in France and Scotland, so transporting the Queen of Scotland would make them lawbreakers in England too. "We just don't ask questions," his papa advised. "The less we know, the better off we are. And if we don't know, we can't tell anyone." "Can we now?" Geoffrey smiled. He knew how to keep a secret. Calais, France, August 19, 1561. "Wake up, Geoffrey!" Geoffrey opened his eyes to see his father gently shaking his shoulder. "We have passengers. I need you to escort them to the cabin. Help them with their baggage and bolt the door. Once you have bolted the door from the inside, I will pile barrels and freight outside the door. I want you to stay with them during the crossing to reassure them." Geoffrey nodded and sat up. This would not be the first time they had taken secret passengers who had boarded during the night. However, whoever it was must have paid extra and needed extra secrecy to have them covering up the door of the cabin. He threw on his clothes quickly and ran out onto the deck. A small knot of people were hurrying up the plank. "This way," he said as he led them into the cabin. There were 3 women in black and some men. One of the women was seated in the cabin, the other 2 huddled close to her. Geoffrey could not see their faces by the flickering lamplight, for they were wearing heavy black veils. 2 of the men remained in the tiny cabin with the women. The rest bowed and kissed the hand of the seated woman and disappeared back out onto the deck. "I have water and some bread and a little cheese here on the table," Geoffrey said. "If you have need of anything, please tell me." One of the women turned to Geoffrey. "We need nothing," she said. "We have a few provisions with us, too. All we need is a safe crossing." Geoffrey nodded. He closed the door and brought the large bar down into the latch. He could hear his father stacking crates against the door on the outside. Geoffrey leaned against the barred door. This is going to be a long voyage, he thought. He wished he could be out on the deck helping his father instead of being cooped up in the tiny room. Geoffrey was right. It was a long voyage. His mind wandered as he stood guarding the door. Could this be the Queen they had been warned of seeking passage to Scotland on their little boat? It seemed unlikely, yet surely if she was trying to cross the Channel without being detected by the English ships, a tiny boat like theirs would be more likely to make it. Since his talk with Mr. Knox, Geoffrey had been thinking through many of the things that he had always believed in. "I guess I'm not really a good Catholic anymore," he thought. Many of the things Mr. Knox said made much more sense to me. Yet his brow wrinkled as he thought, "I've talked to many heretics now, and it seems that each one believes something just a little different from the others. How do I know what's really true? I guess if I had been educated as a priest, perhaps I could read the scriptures for myself. A few scriptures are available out there, but they are so expensive and hard to find and illegal in most places." He frowned. It was true what Mr. Knox had said about many of the church leaders being corrupt, and yet he thought about recent years in England. King Henry VIII had become a Protestant, and he did not seem to be much of a saint. He had problems with adultery and cut off the heads of people who didn't agree with him. It was confusing. Perhaps, Geoffrey thought to himself, perhaps I'm not a Catholic or a Protestant, or a follower of any one of these people. Perhaps I'm just a follower of Jesus, and if I continue to pray and ask, he'll help me to learn what is right and what he wants me to do. His gaze shifted to the woman in black seated across from him. As a follower of Jesus, should he assist the Catholic Queen? Would it be wrong to help her escape to Scotland, to lead her people there against the Protestants? Or would it be wrong to betray her and let someone know who she was and where she was, knowing that that would lead to her death? Geoffrey sighed. Surely it must have been easier for Christians during other times in history. These times just seemed so hard. How could he know what God wanted him to do? He closed his eyes and asked for help. I drew close to him. His guardians were close too, as well as several others hovering over the tiny craft. With a sigh, Geoffrey opened his eyes again. It was impossible for a 10-year-old to figure out all of the answers, but surely as a follower of Jesus, he should be kind to all of the passengers on his boat, whether they were Catholic queens or heretics. He shifted his weight to the other foot. Yes, that was answer enough for him right now. As they pulled into port, he could hear the hands on the deck running back and forth, working the sails and hauling the ropes. The loud scraping of boxes being moved let him know it was almost time to get off. As the last box was moved, he lifted the heavy bar and opened the door. Papa was on the other side, and when the door opened, he bowed deeply. "Your Majesty," he said. The lady in black stood and walked over to him. She lifted the black veil from her face and looked at him, her eyes peering deep into his. Geoffrey noticed big dark circles under her eyes. She looked as if she had done a lot of crying. "Thank you for your kindness," she said. Papa spoke. "Your Majesty, we are at the Scottish port of Leith. You have arrived safely." She looked at Geoffrey. "Legends say that those who drink from the river of Leith forget everything they've seen." Geoffrey nodded. "We will all drink its water this morning," Geoffrey's father assured her. She nodded and lowered the veil back over her face, then stepped out onto the deck. As Geoffrey followed her out, he noticed a large group of soldiers waiting at the bottom of the gangplank. With a sigh of relief, he noticed the Scottish royal family's coat of arms on their banner. They had delivered the Queen safely. The English Channel, August 25th, 1572. Geoffrey stared down the gangplank and into the seaside port of Calais. He made his way to his usual inn and sat down at one of the tables. "Monsieur Geoffrey, it's good to see you again," said the innkeeper. Dinner? Excuse me. "Yes," Geoffrey said. "A bowl of stew for Mr. Geoffrey," the innkeeper shouted to the young lady running back and forth to the kitchen, "and bring him something to drink." "Yes, Papa," she replied. The innkeeper sat down across from Geoffrey. "How's business?" he asked. "Good," Geoffrey said. "We've been staying busy and have had full cargo both ways." Grunted the innkeeper. "Are you booked for the passage back?" "Not yet," Geoffrey said. "You have contacts for me?" The innkeeper muttered. "But they are very fond of secrets. They wish their cargo to be handled carefully, and the men shipping it wish to travel in the cargo hold with their cargo." Geoffrey nodded. "It could be done, I suppose," he said. "Where can I meet them?" "When they bring their cargo, if you're back to your ship by 10 tonight, they will be ready to board." Geoffrey nodded. It was not uncommon for people to want to load their cargo at night, or to guard it if they were shipping valuables. Geoffrey was 21 years old now, and his father had put him in charge of all the cargo shipping. His father ran the ship and the crew. Business was good, and Geoffrey and his father were planning to buy a second ship by the time Geoffrey was 26. Then each would be a captain. At 10 o'clock, Geoffrey was back on his ship. He had opened the hold and was ready to receive cargo right on time. 4 men emerged from the shadows, carrying 2 very large wicker trunks. "Here, my crew will help you," Geoffrey offered. "No," they said. "Thank you, but our belongings are very fragile and very valuable, and we must carry them ourselves." Geoffrey shrugged. "As you wish." The men returned to land and soon brought 2 more of the large basket trunks up the gangplank. How many of those do you have? Geoffrey inquired. 12, they answered. We have room for more cargo than this, Geoffrey grumbled. I thought you said this was a full load. We'll pay for the full cargo, one of the men volunteered. Geoffrey nodded. He thought he heard the sound of coughing coming from the cargo hold. But then 2 of his crew and one of the men in black started coughing violently too. It was hard to tell. The men quickly carried their heavy baskets up onto the ship. We will sail immediately, they asked. As you wish, Geoffrey said. We've restocked all of our provisions this evening and our crew is on board. The man nodded. We'll sit in the cargo hold with our belongings, Geoffrey nodded. The men lowered themselves into the hold and he closed the trapdoor from the deck. Why anyone would want to ride down there in the musty darkness was beyond him. It wasn't, however, beyond me. I watched the clusters of guardians steadying each basket with its precious cargo as the men carried it up the gangplank. Still others stood along the docks, holding back the forces of darkness and closing the eyes of anyone who might notice anything that was happening. Shortly after they left the port of Calais, Geoffrey, standing on the deck, heard a cry. He listened for some time and then heard it again, but it was quickly muffled. I watched as a look of understanding swept across his face. He went to the cabin and lit a lantern. Then he opened the trap door and slowly climbed down the ladder. He heard a frantic shuffling as he climbed down in silence. The 4 men stood. It's okay, Geoffrey whispered. You are safe. No one will hurt you here. I am one of you. The men said nothing and looked at the floor, but a curly little head popped up from behind one of the baskets. Did you hear that? He said. He's one of us. Color drained from the men's faces. Get down, one hissed. Geoffrey laughed. It's okay. Why don't you let them all out of their basket prisons until we get into harbor? No one will disturb you down here. I will be back in a few minutes. Don't go, said the little voice. Geoffrey smiled. Shall I leave the lantern here? One of the men nodded. Thank you, Monsieur. He's afraid of the dark. But I try not to be, the little voice added. Papa told me the angel of the Lord camps around little boys and takes care of them. That's right, Geoffrey said, and maybe he even understands about being scared of the dark and sent me down here with a lantern for you. The little boy smiled. Do you think he understands about being hungry too? He asked. Yes, I think he does, Geoffrey agreed. I'll be right back. Geoffrey did return soon with a large loaf of French bread under his arm and a bag with cheese and grapes in it. Here you go, he said. We don't keep much food on board because we do only channel runs, and they're fairly short. But this should hold you over. Oh, thank you, Monsieur, the little boy responded. He fell upon the bread and cheese as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. By the time Geoffrey returned, several others were in the room, and the wicker trunks lay open. They were all sharing the bread and cheese and fruit snack that Geoffrey had brought. So tell me what has happened, Geoffrey invited. I heard terrible things at the inn. One of the men nodded. It was terrible. I hear it was worse in Paris. The persecution had lightened up for some time. We thought everything was okay. Then suddenly yesterday, all over France, we were attacked. Word is that the Jesuit priest, who's the spiritual advisor to the king, told the people that by killing all the Protestants in France, they would be forgiven for their many sins. They must have committed an awful lot of sins, observed the little boy between mouthfuls of bread. Aye, Geoffrey said, perhaps. They killed so many in Paris that it is said that blood flowed down the streets like a river. We were not in the city, but we had to go around several villages to reach Calais. The rivers are so filled with bodies that the people may not eat fish for months because of the contamination. Already we saw wolves coming down from the hills to feed on the bodies lying in the roadways. It was terrible. Geoffrey shuddered. I know that many have been leaving France. I guess those who have survived this terrible massacre will be more anxious to go." "You are very good to help us," one of the women said, "and we thank you." Geoffrey stayed and talked with the fugitives. The tousled little red head curled up in his lap when his tummy was full and fell asleep. Geoffrey heard more about the horrors of the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day. After a time he said, "I must get back up on deck." He deposited the little boy in the arms of his daddy and climbed back onto the deck. As he was just setting the trapdoor, he noticed one of the deckhands watching him. A small shaft of light was coming from the cargo hold. Geoffrey jumped. I left my lantern down in the hold," he said. "I will be going back down there in just a few moments to retrieve it." The deckhand nodded and then said softly, "The little one is my nephew." Geoffrey smiled. "I suppose that was you coughing to cover up for him." "Yes, sir." "You're a good man," said Geoffrey. The deckhand disappeared into the shadows, and Geoffrey went to find his father. The English Channel, A.D. 1573. "So what is our cargo today?" asked Geoffrey's father. Then, glancing at his son, he said, "No, never mind, don't tell me. It's best I don't know these things." Geoffrey smiled. "Just valuable cargo, Papa," he said. His father shook his head. "You are determined to take such risks." "I have to," Geoffrey said. "They're killing people in France. We have to help them escape." "I suppose we do," his father replied. "It's good for business." "It does not seem to be good for France's business, though," Geoffrey pointed out. "How so?" asked his father. "Well, as I talk with the cargo, all seem to be skilled workers. They are weavers and textile merchants, skilled jewelers and silk weavers. It seems that France is losing her best manufacturing skills. Either they kill them or send them to be galley slaves in the French Navy, or else we're helping them to escape to other countries." His father nodded. "I hear the whole group of clockmakers is gone from Paris, either dead or escaped to Switzerland, and many of the skilled jewel cutters have moved to Belgium." "It's true," Geoffrey said, "and we've taken many of the weavers and textile experts to England and Holland." No, I didn't want to know that," Papa warned him. "Right," Geoffrey answered. "It doesn't seem right, though," Papa said. "I heard that when the news of last year's massacre reached the Vatican, instead of the Pope's being upset with his people for such bloodshed, there was a great celebration. He had a commemorative medal struck to honor the occasion, and even commissioned the artist Vasari to paint a mural of the massacre. Can you imagine?" "No," Geoffrey answered, "I can't. He's no longer my spiritual leader. We can look only to Jesus as a good example because our church leaders do not provide that." "Son," Papa warned, "don't let anyone else hear you say that." "Papa, had you noticed that he even uses a red dragon as his heraldic symbol on his coat of arms?" "Yes, so? But the scripture uses that symbol for the devil." "Geoffrey, let's not talk about this anymore," Papa said nervously. "You know, Papa," Geoffrey predicted, "before this is over, I think all of us will have to choose whether we are going to do things the way God asks us to, or the way people ask us to do it. In the end, none of us will be able to look to any human leader. We will just have to find out what God really wants us to do and follow only Him." Papa nodded. "Maybe so," he said, "but I'm uncomfortable about making a decision that carries such grave penalties." Geoffrey laughed. "Yes, but you support me in my decision. And you've protected all these shiploads of cargo all this time. I think I know where your heart really lies, Papa." Papa looked at his feet. "God knows too," Geoffrey said softly, "and He will help you keep understanding things until you make a decision. Meanwhile, I love you, and I appreciate your loyalty." Well, yeah, Papa mumbled gruffly. I guess we better get to that cargo, huh? I guess, Geoffrey agreed. Epilogue. Geoffrey, through his example, influenced many people, and his father became a Protestant too. They were responsible for helping many Huguenots and Anabaptists escape from France and settle in other European countries. Geoffrey was right. It was a great drain on some of France's most talented workers. France lost its best manufacturers and merchants, either to the sword, to the galleys, or to other countries. By refusing to allow people to follow what the Scriptures said, and trying to force them to follow church leaders and traditions, the country's greatest assets were drained. It would not be long before France would be bankrupt and brought to its knees, and a time of even greater bloodshed was looming on the horizon. Still, those who escaped carried light to all of the countries they went to, and God's word continued to be spread throughout Europe. While many of the Most High's servants died during this time, the guardians were able to defend many as they escaped from France. And that's the end of that chapter in the book War of the Invisibles. The next chapter is called Monique, and it takes place in France in AD 1789 to 1794. Again, this book parallels the adult book, The Great Controversy, but this book was written specifically for 5th to 8th grade, 10 to 14 age range, and it is written from the perspective of a guardian angel who was assigned various people in history, and the story is written as if he is telling the story of his recording assignments along the way.